Yeah. All right. So the idea of this, the idea of her work, her book, was to, see if she could create a piece of fiction that was completely separate from her life, or from what was going on in her life. That was like the idea. And I guess that's kind of one of the main questions about this work is how do the two narratives kind of interact? And I think there's I'm sure we're going to talk about some of the similarities, some of the differences. And I think the conclusion we'll probably come to is like, how is she successful in doing that, or what can we learn from like the technique of this book? Natasha, you said that you enjoyed like reading it, right? You enjoyed the experience of reading it. Maybe we could talk about that first, like the experience of actually reading, because I think there's some interesting stuff about that in the book.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, absolutely. I think, like I said before, it was, first of all, very surprising. I didn't expect to be reading a parallel text, so two stories at the same time. And I found the way she did that was, as I said, surprising, but also it really opened my blinkers. It was sort of like, wow, so this is possible. You could actually create two parallel stories which complement each other and augment the meaning in both of them.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and adding to that, I just also thought, okay, I took it for granted. It's okay, it's 112 pages. But I think the story really demands work from its reader, a lot of concentration, a lot of slow reading, and a lot of contemplation, of course. So it was dense, but light at the same time.
Yeah. I like retrospectively, I wish I'd read it as a short story, as in one sitting, because I found it quite, especially at the start, it takes a while to get into it. It's quite fragmented, and going back to it in a few different sittings, it was quite like, well, I had to go back and read. Because it was quite, especially at the beginning. And it takes you a while. Something I like about this is that it is quite an original, well, I haven't read anything quite like this. So it was like, it's something I wrote in my notes. It was rewarding to read it, looking for these clues and like similarities and the links. It was more like an investigative kind of reading. So you're trying to find out what's going on, as opposed to just kind of switching off and just letting it wash over you. I feel like the reader's quite present, like going through this. Like you actually have to do some work as a reader, which is cool.
Yeah.
Another thing just on reading it, which was interesting, and it was like quite a physical read, as in you would like go to you'd be reading in the margins and finish a page, and then you had to make a decision whether to turn the page and neglect what you'd read, neglect the other side of the thing, or go back. So I was reading just like everything I had here, which means I would like be half a sentence off here, and then have to resume that then when I turn the page. I don't know how you actually read it, like physically read.
It's true. I think in the beginning, I sort of like, I think your mind tries to make patterns, right? It tries to form patterns. So at first, as well, I think I was reading the margins first and then going to the body, the middle bit, the fictional bit. But then it started to change as the narrative flowed and, as it took its own flow. Sometimes I would just go through the margins and then go back and go through the body, or do it alternatively. So I think it's just, as you get into it, it's your mind and what the actual content is at that point is what will hold you, I guess.
Right.
But yeah, I did notice that sometimes. And then I think it was kind of a relief at the end when I didn't have to, in the last few pages, there's nothing in the margins, and then all of a sudden it's just you, Kareem, and Maya. And then you actually like, oh, okay, cool. So now it's just us three.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was interesting. I also found that it was highly contrasting.
Right.
And when I went to look it up and see what the academic term for that is her metafiction, or the facts that she's putting in the nonfiction side of the story, which is the marginal story, not the marginal story, but the story in the margins, against the main body, the fictional work. it's really, she really brings out a much darker side, even though it's a domestic story. It's domestic London story. Yes, they're in London, but they're obviously tied and tethered to their cultural histories and their family histories. But the non-fiction that's provided in the margins is really dark and at times horrific.
Yes.
And even though in the fiction aspect, as a reader, it's sort of like a relief that it's fiction. But I feel like what she's saying in the nonfiction aspects is sort of like a tough reminder that this might be fiction, and you might be just, having spending some time with these two characters, but in real life, this is actually what's going on. I think some of the stuff gives about people disappearing because of political activity, annihilation of certain castes in India. I mean, it's horrific. So I think that really works well, and that really came through. And that even though you're sort of going in between the fiction and the nonfiction, she has a way of marrying that and making it very, very stark and contrasting.
Yeah. And of course, towards the end of the book, I think, so there's interesting parts where in the margins, she as a narrator, she as an author, rather, she's not a narrator, she's, mix of both. But she says, okay, I need to do something now to mess up this story, to there's a part where she says, okay, she says, I'm not sure about how settled they are. She wants to instill some drama into the lives of Maya, and they have their drama, Maya and Kareem, but she's like, and that's when he disappears. So it's interesting to see her thought, he disappeared. So it's interesting to see her thoughts there as a writer, realize that there's conflict needed. But I also think that there's an overlap, obviously, with Kareem disappearing in he's from Libya, right? No.
Tunisia.
Tunisia, that's it. So he's from Tunisia, and he disappeared. And there's that overlap of these systems and these atrocities and these kind of inhumane, government forces and things like that. So there's that overlap between what she's talking about in her as a writer, obviously what she feels very strongly about what's happening in her homeland, that kind of seeps through into Kareem's life when he's eventually involved in the politics of his country, and he goes back because he believes strongly in that. So they've got some sort of energy between them, I feel, even though they're man and woman, different countries, there's this shared kind of energy, I think.
Absolutely. And on that point, I just found, especially, I think it's around page 75 of the part you mentioned, where she's saying she's torn between keeping them nice and, in their domestic cocoon, or adding some drama. I find it also works as an effective foreshadow. So you kind of get ready, as a reader, you're getting ready for something really bad to happen. And at the same time, she relies a lot, kind of like what we noticed in The Red Pill, how he goes into different people's stories. I think in this one, Mina goes into other stories, like when she's talking about her friend, I think Rona and Jason, and how they get arrested, I think by the certain things like unlawful activities to Presentation Act, based on that, for example. So she's, as you say, she's giving actual stories of friends and people she knows. And then in the story that she creates, the fictional story, you do see this happen to Kareem. So yeah, which I guess more of a horror and more realistic.
I'm not sure if she really tried to keep the two narratives separate. Obviously, she's telling an interesting and very a story that needs to be told. But she kind of claims at the start, I was trying to create a fiction separate from my own reality. Either she's shown that that's kind of impossible, or that she didn't want to do that in the first place. I'm not really sure. We can never really know her true intentions, but from the text, there's these huge similarities. I saw a lot about, could we talk a little bit about her reaction? So the first novel she wrote, or the novel she wrote before, she was really angry about the critics, or not angry, but she felt like she hadn't really been, her novel had not been seen in as a novel. It was just seen as a memoir, which was partly due to her being like a non-white woman, basically. And she felt that she'd made this novel, which was like, you know, had a lot of its own literary merit, and it was like very well pieced together, but then people just saw it as a memoir just because of who she was. And I feel like, well, did you have any comments on that?
No, I'm keen to hear what.
Yeah, okay. Because then Kareem, because the point I was going to make, Kareem as a filmmaker, it's really interesting to see him also. They like people like his university and the people around him and like the academic. He's a non-white man. He's from North Africa, isn't he? So Arabic man. And then they're trying to put these pressure on him to make certain films about terrorism or like films about basically being Arabic. And they're saying, oh, you should make a film about the different experience of wearing a burqa in Britain and France, and I think it was the burqa. But yeah, so they're like putting they expect these things from him, and he doesn't want to make that. And I found that interesting to see. Obviously, that's her as an author. I think she's putting onto him some of her negative experiences in the kind of academic and artistic world.
Yeah. And I guess to your point, to some extent, she does in the end demonstrate that you can't really separate your own experiences. And for me, the most striking chapter, I mean, all of them were very striking, but for me, the most striking chapter was the one called Mixed Marriages. In it, you've got Maya and Kareem, sort of like she's already taken you through their internal insecurities and vulnerabilities, but then when she's at work and the questions she's asked by her peers and everything, and how she decides, you know what, okay, that's them. I'm going to still love this man. I'll walk outside with him, really proud. And I found that very interesting, but also the way she overlaps that with, in her real life now, because she also has a mixed marriage with Cedric, she tells us, and how she demonstrates her research, and she's watching a YouTube from 1958. I found that very interesting, and how they're inspecting or discussing and interviewing mixed marriages. Right. So she's comparing 1958 concept of mixed marriage in Britain against her own in real life currently, and then Maya's and Kareem's at the same time. So I found that, again, as you say, she's still central to both the fictional and the nonfiction aspect. Exactly. So I don't think she really removed herself from it, but it also lent more to the meaning of all of the stories.
Sure. Do you think there's a reason why, like, I would argue that Kareem is more of the protagonist of the fictional part of the story? Would you agree?
He is, but I think so is Maya. I think their relationship could be a protagonist itself. Right. Because it's got a whole society that it's literally fought, even though it's just psychologically, it's sort of like it has to it's going through its own tests and trials and questioning its own existence. So I think take it a step further and say their love is a protagonist. Okay.
I don't know, maybe it was, I just felt Kareem had slightly more protagonism than Maya, but maybe that was just my reading. And then I was wondering if that's true, I wonder why as an author she kind of made a man, I don't know, but I think it doesn't matter that it was a man or a woman or whoever, she was just putting those same energies and trying to explore some of the same things that she'd experienced in her life, and
True. And I guess that's why it is a work of parallels, right? So in her real life, she's the female. But actually, as you say it now, to me, in my mind, I'm like, actually, that's true. Kareem, in a way, had more to lose, didn't he? And as you say, he's the one who had to come in on Maya's papers, for instance, I think, or it was a bit harder for him, right, to be in Britain than it was for Maya, because Maya.
Yes.
So he's got, in a way, he's sort of got more to lose all around. Maybe that's why the sense that he's more of a protagonist. But yeah.
Possibly, yeah. Okay, so just a few last comments before we finish. I really enjoyed the language in this book. I thought it was really, really well done. It was so, I think I said in my comments on the discussion, everything was so lean. Which I mean, so at the start of the book, let's go to it. So when we're first introduced with the two narratives that we've got in the margins is very narrative based. It's like telling you information. It's very succinct. Whereas in the fictional side of it, it's much more poetic at the start. And that kind of disparity as a reader was quite like disorientating and maybe a little bit jarring at the start because you don't really know what you're actually reading. Like you're reading about this woman in Glasgow, and she tells you a little bit about she's reading the paper and there's different things coming up, and then in the middle you've got this seemingly disconnected kind of series of objects and fragments. It's very, and also bits of poetry. And it takes actually a while to get going. It takes you a while for the kind of narrative, this person to be born in the narrative. At the same time, she's talking in the margins about this character she wants to make and stuff. And then I feel like it's very aggressive how it's kind of like this kind of energy creates the narrative. At the end of, I think, the second chapter, she says, in the fictional side, she says, one has to breathe fire in order to breathe life into love. These jolts, this insistent thrashing is what it takes to get to its jolly jumping heartbeat. There's this energy of the story kind of just like erupting in a way. I don't know.
Yeah, she has a way of sort of taking you like on a ride. So like you're saying, it could really be calm and sort of soft, and like it's like softer, rounder words and like things to wade through, and then sometimes, like you're saying, just bursts of energy, and you can see her poetic strength, her come through. And I think for me, I'll just read maybe one or two lines that I really loved. I think this was in the nonfiction part. So she's talking about Cedric, her husband, and she says, Cedric is home, I want to say. See, home is now a person, not a place. I'm with him. I'm here. I'm home. There is no returning anywhere.
That was lovely.
Simple, really powerful, and yeah.
That's powerful, yeah. And I suppose just thinking now, like the separation of the two, of Maya and Kareem at the end, is kind of the opposite of that. No, there's that togetherness, and then they eventually are torn apart. So what about, just to conclude, like, could we say anything about I think she tried to create something separate from her own narrative, but eventually it goes towards, I think, her hatred towards these oppressive regimes and this kind of, this world, like it goes towards kind of violence in the end, no? Because we don't know where Kareem's going to end up. He's basically out of control of his own destiny by the end.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, in the end, she is an activist. She writes about the struggle, and I think ultimately she goes back to what her truth is, whether that's in fiction or nonfiction. Yeah. You see how her inner life affects her fictional life too. So yeah, as you say, I think it's very difficult to separate, even when you try intentionally. And it was a very powerful read, and a great example of what postmodern narrative fiction should look like. So yeah, in my conclusion, I think that's that.
Cool. I was wondering, just the last thing, like in terms of the experimentation, if it could have been even more experimental, as in you could have seen, eventually it kind of folds down into one narrative. I wonder if they could have interacted more, like the margins could have been infiltrated by the fiction side. I don't know. I feel like there's more potential there, but I suppose you can always be more experimental. But
yeah. Well.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think that's everything we have to say about that. I really enjoyed the book.
Likewise.
Yeah. Thanks, Natasha. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.